6-year-old Finn had always wondered why her grandfather Captain Joe talked to the ocean like it was his oldest friend, why he knew exactly where to drop his nets without looking at any maps, and why other fishermen always asked him for advice even though he was the quietest man she knew. On Joe's final fishing trip, Finn was about to discover that her grandfather wasn't just a fisherman, he was an ocean whisperer who had spent 60 years learning the sea's secrets. What he taught her in those final 12 hours would change how she understood patience, respect for nature, and the art of reading life's hidden currents. This is the story of a little girl who learned that the deepest wisdom comes from the quietest teachers, and sometimes the greatest adventures happen when you're saying goodbye. Finn Murphy had spent every summer morning of her 6 years watching her grandfather Captain Joe prepare his fishing boat, the Mary Catherine, named after her late grandmother. Joe was a man of few words, but his weathered hands spoke volumes as they checked nets, tested equipment, and prepared for another day on the Atlantic waters off Cape Cod. That's why the quiet conversation she overheard between Joe and her father felt like thunder in the stillness. "The arthritis is getting worse, son," Joe said, flexing his gnarled fingers. "Can't grip the nets like I used to. Yesterday I nearly lost a whole catch because my hands gave out." "Dad, you don't have to stop completely. Maybe just cut back." 60 years is enough," Joe interrupted gently. "The sea's been good to me. Time to be good to the sea and step back." Finn pressed her ear closer to the kitchen door, her heart racing. "What about Finn? She loves going out with you." Joe's voice softened. "That's why I want to take her on one final trip. Just her and me. Teach her what the ocean taught me." "She's only 6, Dad. The sea doesn't care about age. It cares about respect. And that little one already has more respect for the water than most grown fishermen I know." That evening, Joe found Finn sitting on the dock, her small legs dangling in the water. "Heard you might want to come fishing with your old captain one last time," he said, settling beside her. "Is it really your last time, Grandpa Joe?" "Afraid so, little fish. But that makes it special, doesn't it?" Finn nodded, though she didn't fully understand why endings had to be special. That night, Finn couldn't sleep. She had been out on the boat with Joe dozens of times, but she'd always been focused on the excitement of catching fish or spotting dolphins. She had never really paid attention to the quiet magic her grandfather seemed to weave with wind and water. The next morning, as she watched Joe prepare the Mary Catherine for their final voyage, she began to notice things she'd never seen before. The way Joe ran his hands along the boat's hull, not just checking for damage but almost greeting an old friend. How he studied the horizon not with his eyes but with his entire body, reading signals she couldn't see. The careful ritual with which he arranged his equipment, not just functionally, but with the reverence of someone preparing for a sacred ceremony. "Grandpa, how do you know where the fish are?" Finn asked as they loaded supplies. Joe paused, considering how to explain something he'd never put into words. "The ocean tells stories, Finn. You just have to know how to listen." "What kind of stories?" "Stories about where the fish like to play, where the current runs deep, where the water is warm or cold. The ocean's always talking, most people just forgot how to hear it." As they pushed off from the dock at dawn, Finn realized she was about to receive the most important education of her young life. 20 minutes from shore, Joe cut the engine and let the Mary Catherine drift in the gentle swells. Finn expected him to immediately start fishing, but instead, he sat quietly, his eyes closed, his weathered face turned toward the wind. "What are we doing?" Finn whispered. "Listening," Joe replied without opening his eyes. "Close your eyes and tell me what you hear." Finn closed her eyes obediently. At first, she heard only the obvious sounds, waves lapping against the hull, seagulls crying overhead, the distant hum of other boats. "I hear water and birds," she reported. "Keep listening." Deeper. Finn concentrated harder. Gradually, she began to notice subtleties she'd missed. The rhythm of the waves wasn't constant, it had patterns, variations. The seagulls' calls weren't random, some sounded excited, others warning. Even the water lapping against the boat carried different tones. "The waves sound different," she said slowly. Joe opened his eyes and smiled. "What kind of different?" "Some are bigger, some smaller. Like music that's not quite the same." "Exactly. Now, what do you think that tells us?" Finn thought hard. "That the water is moving in different ways?" "Very good. The ocean has currents, Finn rivers within the sea. Where currents meet, where warm water touches cold water, that's where fish like to gather." Joe started the engine again and began moving the boat slowly, his eyes scanning the water's surface. "Look there," he pointed to an area where the water seemed to shimmer differently. "See how the color changes? That's a current line. Different temperatures, different flows meeting each other." Finn squinted at the water. Once Joe pointed it out, she could see the subtle difference, a line where the deep blue shifted to greenish blue. "Fish like boundaries," Joe explained. "Places where things change. Just like people, they're curious about what's on the other side." As Joe prepared his nets, Finn noticed something that had never occurred to her before. Her grandfather moved with complete confidence, never hesitating, never second-guessing. But he also moved with profound gentleness, as if he were handling something precious. "Grandpa, why are you so careful with everything?" Joe paused in his work. "Because the ocean isn't ours, Finn. We're guests here. Good guests don't take more than they need, and they don't leave a mess behind." "But you're allowed to catch fish, right?" "The ocean allows us to catch fish," Joe corrected. "Big difference. Permission comes with responsibility." He showed her his nets, not the huge, industrial nets she'd seen on television, but smaller, carefully maintained ones with specific mesh sizes. "These holes let the young fish swim free," he explained. "We only keep what's old enough, big enough. That way, there will always be fish for the next fisherman, the next generation." "Is that why other fishermen ask you for advice?" Joe looked surprised. "You noticed that? You're the quietest person I know, but everyone always wants to talk to you." Joe chuckled. "Maybe because I listen more than I talk. The ocean taught me that. The water never argues, never boasts, never tries to prove anything. It just is. But it teaches everything." As if summoned by their conversation, another fishing boat approached. Captain Martinez, a younger fisherman, called out across the water. "Joe! Heard this might be your last run. Any wisdom for an old student?" Joe waved back. "Same wisdom as always, Carlos. Respect the water, respect the fish, respect the rhythm. Everything else takes care of itself. Carlos nodded seriously, then called to Finn, "You paying attention, little one? Your grandfather's the best teacher the sea ever had." As Carlos's boat moved away, Finn looked at Joe with new understanding. "You're famous." "Not famous," Joe said quietly. "Just old. And the ocean has a way of teaching those who pay attention long enough." Joe cast his nets in 3 different locations, each time waiting patiently for what felt like hours to Finn. At the first spot, they caught a modest amount of fish. At the second, almost nothing. "Are we doing something wrong?" Finn asked, frustrated. "Doing everything right," Joe replied calmly. "The ocean decides what it wants to share today. Our job is to be ready when it's generous, and grateful when it's not." "But what if we don't catch anything?" Joe gestured toward the horizon where the sun was painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. "Then we got to see this. We got to spend time together. We got to listen to the water's stories." "That's not nothing, Finn." At their third location, something magical happened. As Joe lowered his nets, dolphins appeared around their boat, playfully racing alongside the Mary Catherine. "Are they trying to tell us something?" Finn asked in wonder. "They're welcoming us," Joe said. "Dolphins often mean good fishing ahead. They eat the same small fish that the bigger fish hunt." Sure enough, when Joe pulled up his nets 20 minutes later, they were full of beautiful silver fish, more than they'd caught all day. "How did you know?" Finn breathed. "I didn't know," Joe admitted. "I hoped." That's the difference between fishing and gambling. Fishing is about reading signs, respecting patterns, and hoping with wisdom. Gambling is about wanting without understanding. As Joe sorted through their catch, keeping only what they needed and gently releasing the rest, Finn realized she was learning about more than fishing. "Grandpa, this is like being polite, isn't it?" "How do you mean?" "Taking only what you need, saying thank you, not making a mess. Like how Mama taught me to behave at other people's houses." Joe stopped working and looked at his granddaughter with amazement. "That's exactly right, Finn. The ocean is everyone's house. We're all just visitors." As the afternoon wore on, Joe began teaching Finn to read the water's more subtle messages. He showed her how wind patterns created different wave formations, how the behavior of seabirds indicated what was happening beneath the surface, how the color and clarity of water revealed its depth and contents. "See those gulls diving over there?" Joe pointed to a group of birds frantically fishing about a quarter-mile away. "That means there's a school of small fish near the surface. And where there are small fish, there are big fish." Finn finished excitedly. "Maybe," Joe said, emphasizing the word. "But maybe not." The art is in the maybe. Finn reading signs isn't about being certain, it's about being smart with uncertainty. They moved toward the bird activity, and Joe taught Finn to watch for other signs, the occasional flash of silver beneath the surface, the way the water moved differently over a school of fish, even the smell of the water itself. "You can smell fish?" Finn asked incredulously. "Sometimes. When there are lots of them in one place, they change how the water smells. Very subtle, but it's there." Finn sniffed the air experimentally and wrinkled her nose. To her, it just smelled like ocean. "It takes time to learn," Joe assured her. I've been practicing for 60 years, and I'm still learning new things. What's the newest thing you learned? Joe considered this seriously. Last month, I noticed that the fish bite differently on days when my arthritis hurts more. Took me 59 years to realize that my pain usually comes before changes in weather, and fish can sense weather changes before we can. So your arthritis helps you fish better? Everything teaches you something, if you pay attention. Even the uncomfortable things. As evening approached, Joe and Finn sat on the deck of the Mary Catherine, sharing sandwiches and watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "Grandpa, why do you love fishing so much?" Joe was quiet for so long that Finn thought he hadn't heard her. Finally, he spoke. "When I was your age, my father brought me out here for the first time. I was scared of the water, it seemed so big, so powerful. But my father taught me that the scariest things often become the most beautiful when you learn to understand them." "Were you scared today?" "A little," Joe admitted. "Not of the water, but of this being the last time. When you love something deeply, letting go is always scary." "But why do you have to let go?" Joe looked down at his hands, gnarled and stiff with arthritis. "Because the ocean deserves someone who can serve it properly. My hands can't hold the nets steady anymore. My back can't handle the long days. The ocean has given me 60 years of gifts, now it's time for me to give it the gift of stepping aside for someone younger and stronger." Finn studied her grandfather's weathered face. "But you know things that younger fishermen don't know. That's why I teach them. That's why I brought you out here today. Knowledge isn't meant to be hoarded, Finn. It's meant to be shared, like the ocean shares its fish. Will you teach me everything?" Joe smiled. "I'll teach you what I can. But the ocean will be your real teacher. I'm just showing you how to listen." As they prepared to head back to shore, Joe performed what seemed to Finn like a ritual. He stood at the bow of the boat, removed his cap, and spoke quietly to the water. "Thank you for a good day. Thank you for the fish. Thank you for keeping us safe. Until someone else takes my place, watch over these waters." "Who are you talking to?" Finn asked. "The ocean. My grandfather taught me to always say thank you at the end of a fishing day. The water listens, even if it doesn't answer in words." "Do you really think the ocean can hear you?" Joe gestured toward the horizon where the sun was setting in spectacular fashion. "Something this beautiful, this powerful, this alive, I'd be foolish to think it can't hear us. Maybe not with ears like ours, but hearing all the same." As they began their journey back to shore, something extraordinary happened. A pod of whales surfaced near their boat, their massive forms moving gracefully through the water like underwater mountains come to life. "Grandpa!" Finn whispered in awe. "I've seen whales out here thousands of times," Joe said softly, "but never on my last day. It's like they're saying goodbye too." They sat in reverent silence, watching the whales breathe and dive, their presence making the vastness of the ocean feel both humbling and intimate. "Will they remember you?" Finn asked. "I'll remember them," Joe replied. "And that's enough." During the 40-minute journey back to shore, Joe taught Finn practical lessons that would serve her whether she became a fisherwoman or not. "Navigation isn't just about knowing where you are," he explained, showing her how to read the boat's compass and identify landmarks on the shore. "It's about knowing where you've been and where you're going." What if you get lost? Then you stop, you look, you listen, and you remember that panic never helped anyone find their way. The sea has patterns, fin currents always flow somewhere. Birds always fly toward land eventually. The sun always sets in the west. Joe taught her about weather signs, how certain cloud formations meant storms, how wind changes indicated shifting conditions, how the behavior of fish and birds could predict what was coming hours before modern weather forecasts. Technology is wonderful, he said, but it can fail. The signs the ocean gives you never lie, never break down, never run out of battery. Will you teach me to tie fishing knots? For the next 20 minutes, Joe patiently showed Finn how to tie the basic knots every fisherman needs, knots for securing nets, for joining different lines, for creating loops that hold under pressure but can be untied when necessary. Knots are like relationships, Joe explained as Finn struggled with a particularly complex one. They need to be strong enough to hold when tested, but flexible enough not to break under strain. This one's too hard, Finn complained. Everything worthwhile is hard at first. But look, your fingers are already learning. In a few years, you'll tie these knots without thinking, just like I do. As the harbor came into view, Joe began sharing stories that connected Finn to a family history she'd never fully understood. This boat belonged to my father, your great-grandfather Patrick. He built her with his own hands in 1962. And before that, my grandfather fished these same waters from a smaller boat he called the Irish Rose. So our family has always been fishermen? For generations, Joe confirmed. Each one learning from the one before, each one teaching something new to the sea. What did you teach that was new? Joe thought carefully. Patience, maybe. My father was a hard worker but impatient. He'd move from spot to spot quickly if the fish weren't biting immediately. I learned to wait longer, to read the water more carefully. Sometimes the best catches come to those who can sit still. What did your grandfather teach? Respect. He came from Ireland, where they believed the sea had moods, personalities. He taught my father and me to treat fishing not like hunting, but like visiting with an old friend who might share gifts if you're polite and patient. And your father? Persistence. During the hard years when fish were scarce, when other fishermen gave up or moved away, my father kept going out every day. He taught me that dedication matters more than luck. What would I teach, if I became a fisherwoman? Joe smiled at his granddaughter's serious question. That's for you to discover. But I suspect you'd teach something about curiosity. You ask better questions than most adults I know. As they tied the Mary Catherine to the dock for what Joe knew would be the last time under his command, other fishermen began gathering. Word had spread about Joe's final trip, and the harbor community had come to pay their respects. How was the fishing, Captain? Called out Tom Bradley, a middle-aged fisherman who'd learned from Joe. Good enough, Joe replied, showing their modest but respectable catch. The ocean was generous. And the student? Asked Maria Santos, one of the few female fishermen in their harbor. How did little Finn do on her first real fishing lesson? She listened, Joe said, and Finn understood that this was the highest praise he could give. She learned to read the water, respect the catch, and ask the right questions. As they cleaned their fish and prepared the Mary Catherine for her new owner, Tom Bradley, who had bought the boat to continue the sustainable fishing practices Joe had modeled, Finn realized that something significant was ending, but something else was beginning. "Grandpa, will you still come to the harbor?" "Of course. Once a fisherman, always a fisherman. I just won't be taking boats out anymore." "But you'll still teach people?" "If they want to learn. The ocean's lessons don't stop just because I'm not on the water every day." That evening, as Finn's family gathered for dinner with their fresh fish, she found herself sharing the day's lessons with enthusiasm and surprising depth. "Fishing isn't really about catching fish," she announced to her parents. "It's about listening to the water and being polite to the ocean." Her father, Joe's son Michael, smiled. "What else did you learn?" "That everything teaches you something if you pay attention. That you should only take what you need. That saying thank you is important even if you're talking to water." Her mother, Sarah, looked impressed. "Those sound like life lessons, not just fishing lessons." "That's what Grandpa Joe says. The ocean teaches everything, not just fishing." Joe, who had been quietly eating his dinner, looked up at his granddaughter. "What was your favorite part of today?" Finn considered this carefully. "When the whales came to say goodbye. And when you showed me how to read the water's stories. And when you talked to the ocean to say thank you." "Why those parts?" "Because they felt magic. But also real. Like the magic was in understanding something, not in pretending something fake was true." Joe nodded approvingly. "That's wisdom, Finn. Real magic is always about understanding." Over the following weeks, Finn found herself applying her grandfather's lessons in unexpected ways. She approached homework with the patience Joe had shown while waiting for fish. She listened more carefully to her friends at school, the way Joe listened to the ocean's subtle messages. When her best friend Emma was upset about her parents' divorce, Finn surprised herself by saying, "Sometimes the hard things teach us the most important stuff. My grandpa told me that." When her class went on a field trip to the aquarium, Finn's questions impressed the guide. "How do the fish know which currents to follow? Do different fish have different ways of talking to each other? Why do some fish travel together and others swim alone?" Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, called Finn's parents that evening. "I don't know what happened to Finn over the summer, but she's become remarkably thoughtful and observant. She's asking questions I've never heard from a 6-year-old. She spent a day deep-sea fishing with her grandfather," Sarah explained. "One day did all that?" "It was his final fishing trip after 60 years. I think she learned more than just fishing." Every week, Finn visited Joe at the harbor. She couldn't go fishing with him anymore, but she could watch him work on boat maintenance, help him mend nets for other fishermen, and most importantly, listen to his stories. "Tell me about the biggest storm you ever weathered," Finn would ask. Or, "What's the strangest thing you ever caught in your nets?" Or, "How do you know if a fishing spot will still be good next year?" Joe never ran out of stories, and Finn never ran out of questions. More importantly, she began to understand that their conversations weren't just entertainment, they were education in how to live thoughtfully. "Grandpa, do you miss being out on the water every day?" "I miss it," Joe admitted. "But missing something you loved isn't sad if you're grateful you had it at all. And I still have the water, I just experience it differently now." "How?" "I watch it from shore. I teach others to respect it. I remember all the gifts it gave me. The water didn't go anywhere, Finn. My relationship with it just changed. Is that what happens when you get old? Your relationships change? Joe considered this profound question from his 6-year-old granddaughter. That's what happens when you get wise. You learn to love things differently as you grow. 6 months after Joe's retirement, Tom Bradley invited him to join one final fishing trip, not as the captain, but as an honored guest. Would you like to come along? Joe asked Finn. Tom wants to show me how he's caring for the Mary Catherine. The trip was different from their last adventure together. This time, Finn watched Joe watch someone else captain his beloved boat. She saw him nod approvingly when Tom checked the weather signs the way Joe had taught him, smile when Tom spoke respectfully to first-time fishermen aboard, and beam with pride when Tom released undersized fish without being reminded. "You're a good teacher," Finn told her grandfather as they watched Tom navigate to one of Joe's favorite fishing spots. "Tom's a good student. And do you see? The lessons continue even when the teacher steps back. Will I be able to teach someday?" "You're already teaching, Finn. Every time you show patience, every time you ask thoughtful questions, every time you treat someone with respect, you're teaching others how to live." "But I'm only 6. The ocean doesn't care about age, remember? It cares about respect. And wisdom isn't about how old you are, it's about how carefully you pay attention." A year later, Finn started a Young Naturalists club at her school, teaching other children to observe and respect the natural world around them. Her first lesson was about listening, to birds, to wind, to water, to the subtle messages that nature sends to those who pay attention. "My grandfather taught me that everything in nature has stories to tell," she explained to her 7-year-old classmates. "You just have to learn how to listen." Joe came to speak to her club, sharing tales of reading weather signs, understanding animal behavior, and treating the environment as a teacher rather than just a playground. "The most important thing Miss Finn learned," Joe told the children, "is that wisdom comes from paying attention with respect. Whether you're fishing, gardening, or just walking in the woods, if you listen carefully and treat everything with kindness, you'll learn more than any book can teach you." Today, Finn is 8 years old and still visits Joe at the harbor every week. She's learned to tie every fishing knot he knows, can read basic weather signs, and has developed an almost uncanny ability to spot dolphins before anyone else. But more importantly, she's learned to approach life with the same patience, respect, and curiosity that Joe brought to fishing. "Grandpa, do you think I'll become a fisherwoman when I grow up?" "I think you'll become whatever the world needs you to become," Joe replied. "But you'll approach it like a fisherwoman, with patience, respect, and the wisdom to listen before you act. What if the world needs me to do something completely different? Then you'll do it with the same principles the ocean taught us." Whether you're a teacher, a doctor, an artist, or a scientist, you'll succeed if you listen carefully, work patiently, take only what you need, and always say thank you. Joe looked out over the harbor where the Mary Catherine bobbed gently under Tom's care, where new fishermen were learning old lessons, where the eternal rhythm of tide and time continued unchanged. The ocean's lessons aren't just about fishing, Finn. They're about life. And life is the longest, most beautiful fishing trip of all. Every evening at sunset, Finn and Joe still sit on the harbor dock together, watching the fishing boats return home with their daily catches. And in the rhythm of waves against the shore, in the cry of seagulls heading home to roost, in the gentle evening breeze that carries the salt smell of endless possibilities, both grandfather and granddaughter hear the same eternal message. Listen carefully. Respect deeply. Take only what you need. Give thanks always. And remember that the greatest treasures are found not in what you catch, but in what catches you. This story teaches us that the wisest teachers often speak in whispers rather than shouts, and that the most profound lessons come from learning to listen to the natural rhythms that surround us every day. Finn and Joe's journey shows us that respect for nature and patience with life's processes aren't just environmental values, they're fundamental principles for living with wisdom and grace. Because in the end, whether we're fishing for dinner or fishing for meaning, the same truths apply. The best catches come to those who wait with purpose, listen with respect, and approach each day with gratitude for the opportunity to cast their line into the vast mystery of existence.